Welcome to Politics in Practice, the A-Level revision podcast for you, the current students, by us, the former students. I'm Julius.
And I'm Izza, and we're joined by Cassidy and Andrea, our tech team. Today we'll be discussing what's been going on in government and how you can put this politics into practice.
Coming up today, we'll discuss the scrapping of NHS England and the government welfare reforms. But let's start a bit further back with NHS England.
Yeah, so Keir Starmer last week announced that he will be scrapping the organisation that oversees the country's health service, the NHS, which was created by Labour government in 1942. Keep listening to hear how we will be linking this news to content both AQA and EdXL teach, which is what powers the PM has in the UK as well as any limits, and how he consults his cabinet.
So why Starmer doing this?
He's the leader of the Labour Party, whose policies feature implementing more government intervention than, say, the Conservative Party would, for example. The PM has therefore said he will be annexing NHS England for more, quote, democratic control to try to tackle bureaucracy, which is a system where important decisions are made by unelected representatives. NHS England falls under this category, making it a problem as it is taxpayer funded. Let's look into NHS England more closely to understand the pros and cons of the government's decision. To go into its origins a bit, NHS England was founded under the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition in 2012. This is not to be confused with the NHS, which was founded by the Labour government in 1942. The BMJ Medical Journal says it was made to give more operational independence to the NHS. Its overall role is to decide how much funding goes into resources for medical services in England in order to reach the government's goals for healthcare. This includes things like negotiating the prices of medicine, funding local care boards, and setting up national vaccine programs. So NHS England's composition is mostly managers, not doctors and nurses. Starmer announced it will be absorbed back into the Department of Health and Social Care, which will bring in money for top services and ultimately cut NHS waiting times, which has been a problem for UK residents for years. It's something the new government made a main priority when elected. Starmer said the shift will be completed in 2 years, which is a good example of the PM adhering to their manifesto.
So, most important question, how can this be linked to the exam specification?
Well, we can talk about the Prime Minister's powers through this news. PMs in the UK have executive authority as they're the head of the government. They have the power to determine the policies in the country, so Starmer can, as a result, choose to abolish the NHS England, even if it does feel like a big move. It is important that PMs do consult their cabinet for decisions, though, and don't just steer the party on their own accord. The UK government functions on the principle of collective responsibility, so decisions are usually backed by the cabinet. As such, it is not totalitarian. Key figures within Keir Starmer's own cabinet are Angela Rayner, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, and Foreign Secretary David Lammy. There is a separate shadow cabinet for the Conservative Party, headed by Kemi Badenoch. A different cabinet format that is less likely is that of a presidential-style government, where the PM exhibits a strong personality and more individualistic decision-making.
So, loads of different people involved. How have the other members of Parliament reacted to this news?
Kemi Badenoch, for example, has approved the NHS England change, but with a caution warning, saying that Labour now had to make sure they strongly deliver after this reorganisation. I think Labour will definitely have to be firm regarding their next steps. Going back on their decision will weaken the public's opinion of government.
Yeah, definitely, especially because the NHS has been such a tricky topic in recent years, and there's been loads of news coverage in particular about getting rid of NHS England.
I totally agree. It's just important to note that this change is subject only to England and not to the entirety of the NHS across the United Kingdom. Students can link this in with devolution, which is the distribution of power from Westminster, which decentralises elements of government, and sharing this power to Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments. As this NHS body only exists in England, hence the name NHS England, the change does not affect other countries in the UK. A con of this decision would unfortunately be the thousands of people subject to losing their jobs. There are about 13,000 employees in NHS England currently, but Starmer has said there are, quote, too many regulations and too many regulators, so the cutback in employees seems necessary to positively change health services management in Labour's eyes. We are all aware of the huge importance of the NHS. If you use this systemic change and Starmer's assertiveness over establishing fair healthcare, this would be a great recent example to reference in your essays to get higher marks. To move on now, though.
Last week, we saw some big welfare reforms announced in Parliament. Keir Starmer and the Labour government have said they will be reforming the welfare system with aims to cut welfare costs by $5 billion by 2030 and get more people into work instead of relying on benefits. The key changes we're seeing are tighter rules around something called the Personal Independence Payment, short PIP. This payment is for people who are limited in their life by a physical or mental condition. The government wants to make it harder for those people to claim money, and over 600,000 people could lose out on benefits of up to £675 per month, so quite a lot of money. For under 22-year-olds, there are even more drastic changes. Disabled young people will be unable to apply for the Universal Credit Health component until they're 22. That means for a lot of people there's a gap where young disabled people might struggle to get financial support at a crucial stage of their lives when they're 18 to 22.
So, in short, and it sounds like I'm minimizing it, but I'm not, what it does mean is less money for fewer people. Why is Keir Starmer doing this?
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't sound very appealing at first. The government says it wants more people in work and less people in benefits. That's why other parts of this proposal include an increase in disability payments for those looking for work, increased support for disabled people in employment, and so on. The idea is that more people in work means a boost for the economy, higher tax revenues, and less reliance on state support. Another reason is that the government's likely just trying to save money, as state spending on welfare has increased in the last few years. The number of people claiming benefits due to long-term sicknesses has risen sharply since the pandemic. Starmer sees cutting PIP payments thus as a very easy and welcome opportunity to reduce that cost.
Okay, but saving money and trying to get the economy going seems like very classic politics that a government will engage in. How is this significant?
Traditionally, left-wing politicians and parties are big on welfare. They often argue that government should put high taxes on high earners while supporting those who cannot work, which is literally the concept of welfare. In that spirit, Labour governments were always expanding the welfare state over the years, and many government welfare services, for example the NHS, as Isa just mentioned, date back to Labour governments.
Yeah, I see that. Labour is big on welfare traditionally and big government, and the Conservatives aren't. And we have seen that most famously under Margaret Thatcher, who has a pretty horrible reputation, right?
Exactly, it's a very, very classic Conservative position that the state should spend less on the welfare state. Conservative politicians often say that people should have more incentives to work and not rely on benefits. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s. She significantly reduced state welfare. More recently, David Cameron's coalition government introduced austerity measures, cutting benefits and welfare programs. So this is normally very classic Conservative stuff.
And there's been huge backlash on this, and it really just does feel like this massive role reversal. I mean, the Tories were voted out. People were excited for this Labour government. People felt that there was this new sense of humanity coming back into the UK politics. And now here we are. It just almost feels like a big slap in the face for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's reversed roles. Keir Starmer and his Labour government are doing exactly what a Conservative government would normally do. Starmer's moving away from traditional socialist values, as you just said, of the welfare state towards a conservative or centrist third-way policy, championed, for example, by sociologist Anthony Giddens. This means he's adopting a hand-up instead of a hand-out approach, encouraging work rather than reliance on benefits.
I totally agree. And we even saw the third way under Tony Blair during his time as Prime Minister. But I never felt, when we were studying the third way and how it was implemented in Blair's government, we never saw anything quite as extreme as this. So why is Keir Starmer doing this?
That's probably the key and a very interesting question. This will likely go down well with more conservative voters, and Starmer's no doubt has in mind that right-wing Reform UK are doing quite well in the polls right now. He might try and take some momentum away from them by adopting policies their core voter base should like. He has already done this before, such as when he cut foreign aid to pay for defense spending. That's also a very classic conservative or even right-wing position. This is also about pure numbers. The UK is in a bit of a pickle economically, with high inflation, a cost of living crisis, and rising government debt. Starmer might be making a calculated move to prove Labour can be trusted with the economy. If he's seen as responsible with public spending, he might convince business leaders and people who would normally not vote for Labour but vote Conservative that Labour is a safe choice for them.
Yeah, I agree. And We've got Rachel Reeves' spring statement coming up very soon as well. I mean, it really is not that easy, though. I mean, we saw some absolute tanking of the economy under the last Conservative government. What do you think Starmer's going to have to do to make sure that people see him as a good prime minister?
Yeah, this is definitely a bit risky for Starmer. He has to make sure people see him as socially aware. Taking money away from disabled people is not exactly something most traditional left wingers love. Labour could be split on this as a party. The trade unions, a core part of Labour's support base, are not very pleased either, they've already said that. Unions and activists often argue that this move undermines the party's historic commitment to social justice and could alienate many core Labour supporters. And if Labour alienates its traditional voters too much, they risk losing support to the left. There's a strong socialist wing in Labour. Some of you still remember Jeremy Corbyn, that whole episode when he was leader of the Labour Party. He, for example, is much closer to traditional socialism than, for example, Starmer is. He now has to be careful not to lose people like Corbyn and that socialist wing.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like a huge gamble. He's winning voters here, he's losing some there. He might be trying to pick up a bit of a Blair era once more. I mean, Blair picked up many voters from the centre right as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it just feels like a really big switch, especially when the general public was so tired of a Conservative government to have, this then be presented to them. It really does feel like a U-turn, almost unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a pretty risky thing for Starmer, because especially if voters feel like he's just becoming a conservative 2.0, as you just said, they kind of rejected that at the last election. So, and even if that may be more in vogue now, they might still just vote for the actual conservatives. So it's pretty risky. But on the other hand, if he does successfully convince the public that Labour can be tough on spending, while still being, compassionate, it would be a winning formula for the next election. He could win in a landslide. And he definitely knows, as you said, this has worked before with Tony Blair. But I'm not sure, are listeners too young to remember Tony Blair?
You know what? I feel that we are even too young to properly remember the Tony Blair era, but God knows I learned so much about him that I feel like I was there.
Yeah.
And I think it might be the same for these guys as well.
That's probably true. But there's a reason for that, because he was prime minister for about 10 years and he had massive impact on the UK. And he was a Labour politician as well, but he did very similar stuff to what Starmer's doing right now. His government introduced welfare to work programs and placed greater emphasis on personal responsibility. Blair was very successful with that shift of Labour to the centre, which he called New Labour. Starmer is definitely taking a leaf out of Blair's book here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too difficult to see that one. And I guess maybe we should be expecting more of these conservative style policies from Starmer in the future.
That depends. If this welfare reform is received well, Starmer might double down and cut even more welfare spending. But if Labour faces too much backlash, he may have to shift back towards more traditional Labour values and that socialist wing. The next few months will be crucial in seeing how this plays out politically.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the backlash that we've seen over the past week has just been huge. And the one thing, if I can say, it does feel a little bit inhumane from my perspective. That his first big policy is to really cut welfare down. And when we look at the humanity of that, it can feel like we are dealing with a Thatcherite government. But we will have to see how it all plays out. How does this now connect to the spec?
Yeah, there's loads of connections to the spec here. We've spoken about the parties, we've spoken about voting behavior and political ideologies. For example, conservatism, socialism, and centrism. There's also links to debates on government intervention, the role of the state, and economic policy. Plus, there's the impact on political strategy and electoral success. So we've definitely covered loads here. And now, finally, to end today's episode, we've got some exam tips.
We would recommend past papers. They are your best friend. Practice, practice, practice with previous questions and put your knowledge to the test. I know it's a drag. I found them so frustrating, but I promise you, it will help you learn what you're more comfortable with and what you still need to revise. So, to link today's topic of Labour policies with some practice exam questions, you could write an answer for evaluate the extent to which the Labour Party has shifted away from its ideological position. You can compare decisions made recently under Starmer with those of the previous Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown, or even compare them with Tony Blair. And as a sneak peek to our next episode, we will be covering Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves' first spring statement, the first Labour Chancellor's statement in 14 years.
So that's definitely an episode you guys can be very excited for. It's going to be quite interesting, so a bit of self-glazing right there. But first of all, thank you very much for listening to today's episode. If you have any topics you want us to cover in the future, please do get in touch with us via Instagram or TikTok on our accounts there. They're all called Politics in Practice Pod, so quite easy to find. Thank you, and until next time.